Hello Kenku. Today I want to talk about context. Building context, the importance of establishing context, but also accidental context. The things that happen because you've built the foundation for them, and whether or not you wanted them to happen, just the way things have been structured and people's perceptions around an event, a subject, a topic, kind of builds towards a certain destination, intended or not. So, bunch of different topics today, bunch of different subsections, not really organized, so this will be a bit fun. But yeah, context. First thing I guess I want to talk about is how I structure sessions in terms of how intense a story beat is going to be, how intense a focus of a particular session is going to be on a singular plot line, or whether it's going to be kind of a mixed up, mashed up plot line, whether it's going to be kind of a transition session. So in terms of transition sessions, whenever I have any of my long-term campaigns come up to a milestone, people level up, we have either completely finished the plot line that led to the level up, or there's just like maybe a half hour, 45 minutes of kind of the downturn of the rest of that narrative, and then the knowledge that we have to build into another session. And for that, the context is kind of really simple, and it's just being very open about what the session is about. On the opposite side, for the very intense storyline, more of a one-shot session, where even in a greater campaign, even when it's supposed to be very sandbox-like, there are some times where, depending on how I'm trying to build the narrative, running the game like a one-shot helps tell a cohesive, compact story that the details don't get lost in. And for that, yes, I can be very open about like, yeah, this is a one-shot session kind of thing. But even then, if the previous session was not built to start us exactly at that moment, it can be a bit jarring jumping from the overall free flow weaving of a great carpet of a story into, we're gonna focus right here. And with that, some change in the environment, some change in the context of the situation can make that transition into this is a one-shot session in the greater context of the campaign actually stick. So there have been times I failed to do this, and there's others that they've gone very well. They've gone exceptionally well. And a couple weeks ago, I actually had one of those. And it's because within a greater campaign, we actually had a guest player, a previous player, come back for the session. And with that change of context, with that change of the who, what, where, when, why, it was extremely easy to drop into the session, like dropping into one of those isolated episodes within a TV show season. And people just understand this is where we are. And having the context of that single session player made everything else fall into line without having to worry about, wait, beforehand I wanted to do this, beforehand I wanted to go shopping, beforehand I wanted to cast these spells. It's so much easier once you just have something that is different from the ordinary to then provide that stable ground to change something about how the game is being run. And especially if it's only for like a single session, or maybe 2 or 3 sessions, but if there's an MO about how a campaign is run, and if you want to change it for just a little bit, having something like a guest player with everyone's consent and everyone enjoying it, but having a guest player changing the virtual tabletop, instead of having like a very grid-based thing, having more of a collage of images, or just something that immediately gives a change in how the players are perceiving what's going on. So that's more of the deliberate building context to affect how you want things to be built and how you want things to kind of stabilize. Opposite of that, there are the things that I've recently been experiencing that have been great changes in context that have allowed for unexpected things to occur. So I very much enjoy playing in person. Despite the fact that my career is built on online play and I'm very thankful for it, there's something about playing in person that I just can't manage to replicate online, and I don't think a lot of people can. But with that, at the beginning of the month, I got to go to Gen Con, biggest gaming convention in the world, however they sell it. But I got to play a bunch of in-person games with strangers, with some players that I have in my long-term campaigns, all of that stuff. And once more, the context of playing in person changes the game, but also the context of playing at the convention changes the game. You know you're playing with strangers, you know that it's an isolated system, it's an isolated story, and there's very much this acceptance of we don't know each other and we don't have time to get to know each other. So everyone, whatever their core instincts of house rules and home brewing and all these different things, people immediately slide back to the median of how the game is supposed to be played and immediately slide back to whatever the game master is saying in the moment is, yes, we're just playing forward because we want to play, we want to get done, but also we don't want to spend the time to check 100 rules. We just don't have time for that. So the context of the place, both in person but then at the convention center, changes how people directly interact. And despite the fact that I've heard horror stories about playing with strangers at convention centers, my friends have heard horror stories, everything that I have done has just had this perspective twisted on it that has changed it. Transitioning from that kind of aspect into what I didn't expect at the convention center is getting to meet up with players and meet up with some players that I have now currently had in long-term campaigns, but also, some of their friends, some of the people from their life, and then hanging out and talking and conversing and it being a much more human experience. Because no matter how much time I spend online with these people, and even if show up before the session, chat a bit, hang out after the session, chat a bit, the in-person context of how I'm interacting with these people changes what conversations are had. So, for instance, sometimes my job comes up as a topic. Sometimes my payment comes up as a topic. And when I'm talking with players about it in an esoteric sense, how I'm doing financially, how the business is doing, how the business is growing, online, that context is both separated by the screen, but also around when we have just played, around when I have provided a service, around when people have paid me money. And in the context of most of the time when we're interacting on Discord, through video calls, through voice calls, whatever it may be, that context is rooted around my professional job. And then getting to meet people in person at Gen Con, in person, going on trips to see people. There's a couple other videos on this channel and the side channel about going to get to meet players in person. But because we no longer have the built-in context of what we're used to being the professional atmosphere, and then getting to meet in person, as opposed to it being a stare-out conversation, it becomes a very human conversation. And people beginning to talk to me about, hey, you should raise your prices. Hey, what you do is very good. You are worth more money. And it is humbling, and it's extremely humbling, but it's also very intentional. It's between people with nothing interfacing between that. And the ability for just the context to affect how people talk to me about the subject was not something I expected. And I'm going to cut the video for a moment because we're going to be passing people and I want to respect them. So yeah, the context of just where you are, why you're with people, affects the conversations that are had, affects the relationships that you have. And whether it's deliberately building of the environment around you or it's just the happenstance of the environment around you, context matters so much. People know this with whether they're working with coworkers or hanging out at a restaurant or a tavern bar, going to the movies, hanging out at people's homes. The context and how you're interacting with those coworkers changes the relationship you have with them, even if it's only for the moment. It may not even be a long-lasting thing, but within the moment, the context matters. How conversations are done, how games are played, how stories are written and run and developed is all based on the context about whether people have gained a job, lost a job, or having family strife. The way that we interact, whether we acknowledge it or not, is contextualized in everything else besides what we're actually deliberately interacting about. And it's important to keep in mind. It's just, it affects things in ways you don't expect if you're not thinking about it. And so it's very important. So yeah, that's kind of just what I wanted to talk about today. And yeah, so this is kind of my SendingKenku, that the answers to who, what, when, where, why, and how are often who, what, when, where, why, and how. Just not the one you're asking.